I didn't waste my life all at once. I postponed it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Wasting feels active. Obvious. You can point to it and say, that's where things went wrong. Postponing is quieter. Polite. It hides inside responsibility and good intentions. It looks like patience. Like discipline. Like adulthood. I told myself I would live later. Later, when things calmed down. Later, when I had more time. Later, when I was more secure, more prepared, more certain. Later became my most used word. At first, it made sense. There were real reasons to wait. Obligations. Expectations. Practical limits. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't lazy. I was careful. I did what needed to be done and told myself that wanting more could wait. Life, I believed, was something you earn. So I focused on earning it. Years passed without friction. I met deadlines. I showed up. I handled problems. I did the things people respect you for. From the outside, my life looked stable, even admirable. I wasn't unhappy in any obvious way. That made everything harder. Because dissatisfaction without failure feels illegitimate. Whenever a quiet unease surfaced, I pushed it away with logic. You're fine. Things are fine. Don't be dramatic. I reminded myself that many people never get the chance to think about meaning or fulfillment because they're too busy surviving. I wasn't surviving. I was waiting. I postponed trips because there would be a better time. I postponed conversations because the timing wasn't right. I postponed decisions because I needed more information. I postponed risks because caution felt virtuous. I postponed myself so consistently that it became invisible. The strange thing about postponement is that it doesn't feel like loss in the moment. It feels like control. You tell yourself you're choosing the optimal path, the safer path, the responsible path. You don't feel like you're giving something up, you feel like you're storing it somewhere safe. But time doesn't store things. It replaces them. I began to notice how often I spoke in future tense. One day I'll. Eventually I want to. Someday I'll figure out. Those phrases sounded hopeful, but they carried no urgency. They allowed me to feel intention without action. Intention became my substitute for living. The realization didn't come suddenly. It crept in through ordinary moments. Standing in a room I had once wanted badly and feeling nothing. Achieving a milestone and immediately looking for the next one, not out of ambition, but because stopping felt uncomfortable. I wasn't moving toward anything. I was extending a delay. One night, I caught myself trying to remember the last time I had done something simply because I wanted to, not because it was smart, not because it made sense, not because it was expected. I couldn't remember. That frightened me. Not because I felt deprived, but because the absence felt normal. Like a muscle that had atrophied so slowly I hadn't noticed when it stopped responding. I told myself I was just tired. Burned out. That rest would fix it. But rest didn't bring clarity, it brought silence. A silence where I expected desire to speak, and nothing answered. I realized then that postponement had cost me more than opportunities. It had cost me practice. I didn't know how to choose anymore. Every decision I faced was filtered through risk assessment. Outcome prediction. External validation. I had become fluent in reasons not to act. They came easily. Automatically. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a life that never quite began. I started to see how often I used responsibility as a shield. How easily I hid behind commitments to avoid confronting the emptiness of my own wants. Responsibility gave me purpose without requiring me to ask what I wanted from my existence. That question felt dangerous. Because once you ask it honestly, postponement stops working. I became acutely aware of time in a way I never had before. Not in a dramatic, ticking clock sense, but in a quiet accounting. Years no longer felt abstract. They felt spent. Allocated. Gone. I wasn't afraid of aging. I was afraid of finishing. Finishing a life that had been all preparation and no arrival. The mental breakdown didn't come as collapse. It came as grief without a clear object. I wasn't mourning a specific loss. I was mourning accumulated laters that had never arrived. Every postponed dream, every delayed conversation, every risk I told myself I would take when the conditions were perfect, they formed a weight I could finally feel. I understood something then that no one had ever warned me about: you don't wake up one day and realize you waited too long. You realize it slowly, when later starts sounding like a story you no longer believe. That night, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Not what do I want to do with my life, but something simpler and more frightening: what have I already missed by waiting? I didn't have an answer. But I knew I couldn't keep postponing the question itself. Once I asked the question, time stopped feeling theoretical. Before that, it had always been something abstract, something that moved forward in calendars and anniversaries, not in consequences. I could think about the future without feeling it press back. I could imagine myself eventually becoming someone else without confronting who I was right now. That illusion didn't survive the question. What have I already missed by waiting? The answers didn't arrive as a list. They arrived as sensations. A tightening in my chest when I passed places I once meant to visit. A sudden heaviness when I heard someone talk about a path they chose years ago without certainty. A dull ache when I realized that some doors hadn't just closed, they had disappeared. I started replaying my life in reverse, not nostalgically, but clinically. Not looking for mistakes, but for patterns. I saw how often I had delayed, not because I couldn't act, but because acting would have forced me to accept uncertainty. Waiting felt cleaner. Waiting meant I didn't have to fail publicly. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to live with the discomfort of being wrong in real time. Waiting protected me from visible regret. What it didn't protect me from was invisible loss. I noticed how my memories thinned as I moved closer to the present. The early years of my life were full of texture, intense emotions, vivid details, moments that stood out sharply. The later years blurred together. Work, obligations, routines. Entire periods collapsed into summaries. Nothing bad happened. Nothing happened. That realization was devastating in a way I didn't know how to articulate. You're taught to fear disaster, not absence. To prepare for failure, not for a life that quietly neutralizes itself. I began to feel anger then. Not explosive anger, the kind that demands action, but a slow, simmering resentment toward my own patience. Toward how often I had congratulated myself for restraint when what I was really doing was avoiding the risk of caring too much. Caring creates urgency. Urgency demands action. Action creates consequences. I had avoided that chain carefully. I saw how often I had framed postponement as wisdom. I'm being smart. I'm thinking long term. I don't want to rush into the wrong thing. Those phrases sounded mature. Responsible. But maturity without movement becomes stagnation. The ethical dilemma surfaced slowly: was it worse to disrupt my life now, or to continue living in a way that no longer felt alive? Changing direction would cost me stability, reputation, maybe relationships. Staying would cost me time I could never recover. Time, once spent, doesn't negotiate. I tried to imagine starting now. Truly starting. Choosing things not because they were optimal, but because they mattered. The idea filled me with both hope and fear. Hope that something could still be reclaimed. Fear that I was already too late. Late for what? That question haunted me. Late to be who I might have been. Late to make mistakes that belong to youth. Late to choose paths that require ignorance and momentum. Late to fail in ways that teach instead of define. I realized how much of my waiting had been built on the fantasy of a perfect beginning. I wanted to start when conditions were ideal, when I felt ready, when outcomes were predictable. But beginnings don't work that way. They require ignorance, awkwardness, exposure. I had postponed those qualities out of myself. As this understanding settled in, the fear deepened. Not fear of change, fear of regret layered on regret. What if I started now and discovered that the spark was gone, that the capacity for wanting had eroded beyond repair? That possibility felt unbearable. Waiting had allowed me to believe that everything was still intact, just stored away. Acting would force me to confront what had actually survived. That's why waiting is seductive. It preserves potential in theory. Reality tests it. I felt caught between two kinds of pain. The pain of staying dull, stretching, almost invisible. And the pain of moving sharp, immediate, undeniable. One would haunt me quietly. The other would announce itself loudly. I had trained myself to choose quiet suffering. I told myself that many people live like this. That meaning is overrated. That life doesn't have to feel personal to be valid. That fulfillment is a luxury narrative, not a requirement. But those arguments started to sound hollow. They didn't come from truth. They came from fear. I noticed how often I still spoke in conditional language. If I were to. Maybe someday. It could be interesting to. Even my inner monologue avoided commitment. I was still postponing inside my own head. That's when the breakdown truly began. Not as collapse, but as pressure. As the sense that something inside me was running out of patience. That the part of me that had been waiting politely was starting to demand an answer. Are you actually going to live, or are you just going to keep preparing? That question didn't accuse me. It waited. I felt the weight of irreversibility then. Not in a dramatic, end-of-life sense, but in the quiet understanding that time doesn't reset when you decide you're ready. You don't return to the starting line. You start from wherever you are with whatever remains. That truth stripped away my last illusion. I couldn't undo the waiting. I could only decide whether it would continue. And for the first time, postponement felt like an active choice rather than a neutral one. Staying still wasn't harmless anymore. It was participation in my own disappearance. That realization changed everything. I wasn't deciding whether to start living. I was deciding whether to keep delaying death in slow motion. The question that replaced all others was simple and terrifying: if I don't choose now, imperfectly, awkwardly, without guarantees, when exactly do I think later will arrive? I had no answer. And for the first time, that silence felt like a warning. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly brave. What I felt was something quieter and far less heroic: resignation toward waiting. A deep, settled understanding that postponement was no longer neutral. It was no longer a pause. It had become a direction. For years, I had treated later as a place I was moving toward. Now I saw it for what it really was: a way of not standing anywhere at all. The strange thing is that once that illusion collapsed, nothing rushed in to replace it. No surge of purpose. No dramatic clarity. Just a stark awareness of where I actually was in my life, without the comforting fog of future promises. It was uncomfortable in a way I wasn't used to. I had always believed that if I ever truly needed to change, the need would announce itself loudly, that it would come with pain sharp enough to justify disruption. Instead, this realization felt almost mundane. Like noticing that a clock had been ticking the whole time, and you simply hadn't been listening. I began to see my days differently. Not as steps towards something, but as repetitions. Mornings that blended into evenings. Weeks that passed without distinction. Conversations that repeated familiar patterns, saying nothing new about who I was becoming. I wasn't unhappy. That was the problem. I was comfortable enough to disappear quietly. Once I saw that, the choice stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling unavoidable. Not because action promised joy, but because waiting promised only more of the same, and I could finally see what the same led to. I didn't reinvent my life overnight. I didn't make bold declarations or radical moves. That would have been another fantasy, the idea that you can undo years of postponement with a single courageous act. What I did instead was smaller. I stopped using later as an answer. When I felt the impulse to delay something that mattered, I questioned it. Not aggressively, not with self-punishment, just honestly. Am I waiting because this truly needs time, or because I'm afraid to begin imperfectly? The answer was uncomfortable more often than I liked. I started making choices without waiting for the feeling of readiness. Readiness, I learned, is a reward you get after you act, not a prerequisite. I allowed myself to start badly. To be unsure. To choose without guarantees. Each step felt fragile. I was acutely aware of time now, not in a panicked way, but in a sober one. I knew I was not starting from the beginning. I was starting from the middle, carrying years of delay with me. That knowledge didn't stop me. It grounded me. There was grief in this process. Real grief. Not just for lost opportunities, but for the fantasy that I could somehow recover them untouched. I had to let go of the idea that life would eventually feel on schedule. It wouldn't. This was my schedule now. And strangely, accepting that made things feel more real than they had in years. I began to notice moments again. Not constantly, not magically, but enough to feel the difference. A conversation that lingered. A decision that felt personal rather than correct. A day that stood out instead of dissolving into the next. These moments didn't erase regret. They gave it context. I understood then that regret isn't always a signal that you chose wrong. Sometimes it's a signal that you waited too long to choose at all. That you mistook caution for wisdom and patience for purpose. Waiting had protected me from failure. It had also protected me from living. I won't pretend that starting late feels heroic. It doesn't. It feels humbling. There's an awareness that some experiences will always remain hypothetical now. Some versions of myself will never exist. That is a loss I carry without drama, but I also carry something else, something I didn't have before. Participation. I am no longer watching my life as a plan that will begin someday. I am inside it, flawed, imperfect, sometimes unsure, but present. My days are no longer rehearsals for a future that never arrives. They are the thing itself. If you're listening to this because you recognize the habit of postponement, because your life is full of someday, eventually, when things settle, hear this gently: later is not a place you arrive at. It's a story you tell yourself to make waiting feel safe. Time doesn't wait for certainty. It moves whether you're ready or not. And one day, readiness stops mattering more than presence. I kept saying later until there was no later left. Not because time ran out in a dramatic way, but because I finally understood that it was being spent whether I participated or not. I can't reclaim what I postponed. But I can stop postponing what remains. And that, I've learned, is the quiet difference between a life that looks intact and a life that actually belongs to you. I don't know how much time I have. None of us do. But I know this: I'm done waiting to begin.